Hi, friends, and welcome back to the Science of Music. Today we will have a brief history of our second woodwind, the flute, so that you can understand how the flute was created and why. And you know you have it when you can name the inventor and understand the creation of the flute. So let's get started. Also today, for the materials that we will need for our class is our instrument history worksheet, which is on Class Dojo, and you can use a pen or a pencil if you're doing this hard copy. In the beginning, the flute was created in 1900 BC. It was likely called the qi, which emerged from China. So on our screen, up in our upper corner over here, we see a map of China. It is not necessarily known exactly where it was created. However, it was created in China, which is really awesome. It is called the qi, like I said earlier, and it was made in 900 BC. So guess what? Guess what? Ready? None of us were born yet. Your mom wasn't born. Your dad wasn't born. Your grandparents were born. That was so long ago. So we have this flute, right? And it most likely looked like the one in our bottom corner. Pause the video and write down some thoughts on this flute that you see right here in our bottom corner where my cursor is. What do you think this material is made out of, and why do you think that they used it? Welcome back, friends. I hope that you paused the video and that you talked about and you wrote down some thoughts on this flute. So I think that this flute is made out of a tree branch based off of the texture and what it looks like. And I think that they used this because it was the easiest form for them, because if we look at our picture of our map, there's a lot of trees, which is demonstrated by these green arrows. So that's what I think. Let's see what you think. Make sure you upload your thoughts on Class Dojo. So then by the 1100s and the 1200s, the flute was widely used in courtly music and saw as a military signaling and marching tool. So in Switzerland, the mercenaries helped popularize the flute in the 1300s because of trading. So the flute went from this one in the lower corner to evolving into this one that we see over here. Why do you think that this flute has like these gold pieces and looks completely different from the one over here? Pause the video and write down your thoughts. Great job! So I think that this flute has the gold and such on it because it was used in courts and stuff, which if you look at Erin Kay's videos, she explains the court system and like the kings and queens a lot better than I can. But that's a sign of royalty. So they'll have gold and they'll have silver and they'll have all these luxuries. So we have to make sure our instruments all look luxurious too. During the Renaissance, it became fashionable for amateur flute players to practice and play together what was known as a consort music in cultured homes. So this kind of music is like regular music, like that they would play in the courts and stuff, and in the courtyards for where the poor and merchants and people lived, and playing that kind of lively and festive music up for the people of royalty who normally only listen to royal music. And the flute was a really important part of this because it was used in both the royal and in the merchants, with the merchants to express their music. And then by the 1600s, it was even more important because the flute was then combined with plucked and bowed instruments like the violin, the viola, and they mixed together to create like a band, and it was really important. So the flute continued to evolve and evolve and evolve. It evolved through the Renaissance with the Italians and the Netherlands people experimenting with the size and the length of the flute. It also continued to develop in the 1600s and the 1700s, where solo flute repertoire emerged, giving players music that featured a range extended below the usual high register melodies, and it called for the player to add more individual character to each part. So then, like, some of our famous composers like Vivaldi, Bach, Handel, Telemann wrote extensive solos for the flute and professional players, and it began to find success traveling from area to area. So this time period, the 1600s and the 1700s, is called the Baroque era for the flute. And there was actually a Baroque flute, which is what we see over here on our screen. And this piece behind it is a flute solo piece by Sir Manzolini. It's a really, really hard flute piece, to let you guys know at home. Pause the video. Think about the way that this flute looks versus these other two flutes. What is one big difference that you see? What is one big similarity? Why do you think this flute looks so much different from the royal flute? Write down your thoughts and then come back to this video. Welcome back. I hope that one of the big differences that you guys saw was the mouthpiece up here. So in this one, the flute is being played vertically, kind of like a recorder, but this is still considered a flute. So they blow into it this way, whereas this one, they blow across, so it's more of like a horizontal, so they play the flute more like this instead of more like this. I think something else that's worth noticing is like how this one is made out of wood, similar to this first one over here. However, this one has all the gold embellishments and has all the artwork. So as we began developing sheet music for just solo flutes, we also began developing workbooks for flutes, but there's also workbooks for other instruments. So this is like a method book, and this is what the flutes use to, the flute players use to practice and to learn the skills that they need to be able to play these professional passages. So in these kind of method books, like the Suzuki one we see on our screen, they learn scales, they learn arpeggios, they learn how to play with good tone, they learn how to play fast, they learn how to play slow, they learn a bunch of music stuff, basically, which then translates into all of the awesome things that they will be expected to do in super hard flute music like this one by Sir Manzolini. So around 1750, London instrument makers took the Baroque flute, which is like this one that we see over here, and added keys and increased the size of it, making it a lot longer. And by the end of the century, the keyed flute was almost universally adopted. Every country had its own style of keyed flute and hosted visiting artists from other countries to show off their repertoire and instrument skill, because making instruments is very, very, very individual, like we saw with our saxophone, on how instrument makers have to make 600 pieces on their own. And then we saw that when we had to make our own saxophone. So if we look at our screen, this top flute, all the way up here, that is what a typical today's flute looks like. And then as we go down, we see down here at the bottom, we see what today's piccolo looks like. But here in the middle are a bunch of the different styles of flutes that we have. This first one right here, next to the piccolo, that looks like more of the one that we saw with Sir Francis Manzolini's flute solo. And then these are slow developments that were made to create the flute that we have today. All of these are made out of wood. Some of these are stained, like this flute right here. Some of them have metal on them. Pause the video and answer this. How do you think the flute went from this to this? What do you think would have happened if we didn't have all of these different versions in between? Welcome back. I hope you answered the question. For me, I'm not really sure how it went from a piece of wood all the way to the new flute that we have today, especially changing materials completely. However, using the engineering design method that we have, we could answer those questions for our next video on the instrument materials. But originally, the flute was played vertically, like this one, like this flute down here by the piccolo, as well as the one by Sir Francis Mancini. And then we switched it into the transverse position, so horizontally, like that we played today. And this arrived in Europe through the traders of the Byzantine Empire and the Middle Ages. And this is actually known as the German flute because the Germans changed the flute model from what it is this way and what it is now this way. And then it just, like we were talking about earlier, it just transitioned from all the different countries, and all the different countries made different flutes until it was universally agreed on 20 years later on the Boehm style flute. And on our screen, we see a picture of a flute that is like completely taken apart, which is really, really cool because you can just see all the different pieces and parts of a flute, which we will talk about in our next video on how we make our materials. But this just shows how individualized each flute is and how instruments are made and how they all need to require so much work and so much detail, because without it you wouldn't have these awesome instruments. So this is Boehm, and he is given the honor of being the creator of today's flute. And he, like we were saying earlier, he created the technology to make today's flute and have the keys and played in a horizontal position instead of the vertical. And his inventions and his innovations and modifications and all these other Asian words made it so that it couldn't really vary anymore, so that we all had a standard type of flute to have. One major change that he created was to rescale the flute so that it had a centered pitch, which allowed for people to tune their flutes with other flutes, as well as tune it with different instruments, so that when everybody played the same note, it all sounded like this, instead of everybody playing the same note and it all sounding like this, because there was no center. And that's a pretty big part of being a musician and being able to create an instrument like that, is because without him, then we wouldn't have been able to have flutes play with other flutes or have flutes play with other instruments. So that was our brief overview of the history of the flute. And we will talk about revolutionizing the design of the flute in our next video, talking about the materials. And we will then talk about how the flute is made and what materials are used so that we can create our very own flute at home. So stay tuned. Keep watching the videos. Make sure you upload all of your questions, answers to Class Dojo so that I can see what we're understanding and what we're not understanding, as well as seeing the work that you guys are doing, the amazing work you guys are doing. And make sure that if you haven't watched our saxophone video, you go back and you watch it so that I can see some of the saxophones you guys are making at home. And I will see you guys on the next one.